Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Adweek Senior Editor Nicole Ortiz. And before we dive fully into today's episode, I want to remind you that you can support our journalism with an Adweek Pro subscription at adweek.com/offer. Kindly check that out if you haven't already. And joining us for today's episode, I have the Executive Director of the New York Times' custom content studio, T Brand, Jane Kendall. Hi, Jane.
Hi there, Nicole.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So to start us off, can you just tell me a bit about what your experience during lockdown has been and what T Brand specifically has been doing during quarantine began and what you guys have needed to adjust to become like a full-time remote world?
Yeah, I think we've probably faced what a lot of other organizations have faced. In the beginning, it was all about stabilizing. It was about making sure that people had what they need to operate in a remote environment. And then to figure out, what's the right balance of communication, both from leadership, but then also just how much face-to-face time do we need in this virtual world? And that's been shifting. We've been adjusting depending on what the needs are. And then, of course, there's like the bigger challenge that I think people are all thinking about right now, which is knowing that we're going to be working remotely longer. How do we get the opportunities to collaborate? How do we replicate the water cooler moments and figure out what are the right mechanisms and cadence of engagement that get us to where people have a comfort level with each other, even between screens? So I think that's where we really are right now. And then there's the final piece that I think there's been a lot of talk about just in general, is that people's day-to-day experiences are so altered, and your personal day-to-day experience will be different from somebody else's. So as a work environment, what can we do to support people who are also playing teacher at home and cook and childcare provider, and other people who are actually more isolated than they're used to being? They're living on their own, and then just finding the right way to engage everybody and give people what they need to get to their best work, even in these times.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've been doing a bit of that on Adweek side. We came up this week with a little bit of a show and tell through our culture committee, and that's been kind of fun to get people engaged during our morning meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been joking that the first few weeks we got to know everybody's pets and kids really well. And those are things we didn't know about people necessarily before all of this. We had some great screenshots of people with like their parrots on their shoulders. And it was just, there's this kind of beauty about being invited into people's personal lives in a way that we weren't before.
Yeah, definitely. My cat's become a Zoom star pretty much.
Yeah.
And can you describe a bit what it's like being an advertising studio during this time, and what changes you've observed in the landscape of the industry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens at the beginning of any crisis is that businesses, and I don't just mean big businesses, all businesses and the people behind them, go through a period where it's really about stabilizing. And that was the first few weeks of the crisis for all of us and for our clients. And that moment of stabilizing very often feels like everything is put on pause while people take stock of what's going on and figure out what they need to do next. During that period, there's actually a lot of fast decision-making that has to happen about how we're going to operate, about figuring out what our clients need from us right now in this moment. And as that starts to move into a more normalizing set of practices and processes, I think the landscape really starts to change for what it is that we think about as our kind of the core capabilities we need to be able to deliver, and in some cases differently from the past. And two that have really stood out, I think, especially in the last month, are, on the one hand, the need to move really, really fast. The context is changing so quickly. Brands are really afraid about putting something out this week that doesn't resonate next week. And that means that we have to be able to move really fast. On the other hand, we also have to really slow down, because understanding context, understanding people's emotions and what they're going through right now to create really relevant content matters more than ever. So it's this world where we're holding these two things that are a little bit in tension sometimes, moving fast, but also slowing down to really unpack what those truths and realities are that are going to be the basis for forming like honest and strong connections between brands and people right now. So those are the two things that I think are really dictating a lot of the industry right now. How well can we do those two things?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like it always kind of comes back to an authentic model for a lot of marketers.
Absolutely. I mean, now more than ever, the people don't want to feel like their emotions are somehow tools on behalf of business or brands. And at the same time, people need emotional support in a way they never have before, sometimes from entities that they never relied on before. And those entities are often brands and businesses that we are still interacting with, even during shelter in place and altered times.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what do you think that the pandemic will do to the industry over the long term?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that I know lots of people are thinking about. I think that there's definitely so I say all of this with a grain of salt because we are still in the thick of it. We're in the thick of it right now. We still don't know how this all plays out, and at the same time, I think that we've seen changes that are probably lasting in as much as the relationships that we both as advertising agencies and studios, but also our clients and their customers and consumers have relied upon, those relationships have all been disrupted. And they've been disrupted in pretty fundamental ways. Now is the chance to actually rethink what those relationships are going to be in the future. In my mind, I often use this metaphor of, a tree that has an existing root system. And right now we need new roots. That is how we're going to build for the future. It's not just about keeping it watered and hoping that things get back to normal. Whatever normal we come to will be different from the past. And so we need these new roots to be laid. And I think that that's a permanent change to the industry. One of the ways that that manifests is probably in an acceleration of some of the trends that were actually happening before. So I was looking at some earnings reports from companies like Shopify and Wix. These are companies that enable businesses to create direct relationships online to sell to people. That direct-to-consumer trend is something that's only going to accelerate. And from an agency perspective, I think we have to think of ourselves as relationship experts. And that those are new relationships for a lot of businesses and brands. They haven't had to rely on this direct line like they are today. And our job for the long term is going to be to get even better at understanding and supporting those kinds of relationships. So I think that's definitely one of the lasting changes we'll see.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what things do you think that marketers should be keeping in mind during this time?
Gosh, there's so many. I mean, at least I speak from my own mind of how many things that I feel like I really need to be thinking about right now. There are two things that I think, part of my background is in disaster recovery before I worked in advertising. And I think a lot about the fact that, although this pandemic is not like anything we've experienced in our lifetimes before, there are certainly examples in the past of how brands have not just survived, but actually managed to create really meaningful places in society and communities and culture in moments where people needed it because of the context, because there was a crisis. And some of the things that I like to remind myself is that even in the most dire circumstances, there's still jokes that make people laugh. And that's really just about keeping it simple and recognizing everybody's basic humanity that we all share. And brands have always played a role in culture and society. And right now, sometimes we need them to keep it simple, to remind us to laugh, to be a little bit more positive. At the same time, and if you don't mind, I'll like get a little bit philosophical here.
Totally.
There's a mental model that I really have been going back to again and again for the last sort of 3 weeks. There's a sociologist named Zygmunt Bauman, a brilliant guy. He wrote a book called Liquid Modernity that some people might recognize. He talked about the fact that one of the ways to look at society and history is as an attempt to balance freedom, some version of freedom, whether for some people that's freedom of choice, for some people it's freedom of expression, for some people it's a more kind of independence-oriented freedom. And on the other side, security and safety. And how we balance that is one of the constant sort of changes that happen in society. And when times are really good, when we feel safe and secure, we can basically overinvest on the other side of the equation. We can put huge value on this sense of freedom. When times aren't good, when we're lacking basic security and safety, that throws everything out of balance. And right now, at the level of society, COVID-19 has thrown that out of balance. And we're busy as a society, but also just as individuals, working out how to bring that into balance again. And it's a paradox. If we give up one to get more of the other, we feel like we've lost something. So it's hard to understand how to raise them both up. I have another mantra, not just that jokes, always make people laugh, but another mantra is that great brands resolve paradox. If a brand can step in and help us, both at an individual level, but sometimes at the level of community or society, help resolve what feels like right now a zero-sum game between this feeling of freedom and sense of security and safety, that brand is solving one of those core, really important problems that we're facing right now and that we're all facing. And that's not usual. Usually our lives are different enough that we're not all facing the same thing at the same time. And right now we're all facing this together. So one of the things that I've been talking about with clients is to figure out how do they play into this? What is it that they can do? What's the generous act or the service mindset they can take to help resolve this paradox for people in society right now? If they can do that, they have an integral role to play in the next few months and probably the future for the long term. But I know it's a bit big-headed, so thank you for staying with me.
No, I loved it. And it really feels like it comes full circle because it brings like what those marketers are obviously struggling with, like the same way their consumers are. And we're able to connect on that deeper level. And I think that's really what it's about at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
And have you noticed any specific brands doing this particularly well that you can share some examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum, I think, because I do think it depends on what world you occupy, what elements of this paradox you're trying to resolve, how you're trying to help people either gain more safety and security or reclaim a sense of freedom, maybe just of expression, but to reclaim that. And there are a lot of examples out there. I think sometimes I look at the B2B world. I look at the likes of a Tableau, for instance, which is a data visualization software that's owned by Salesforce. Tableau has created this COVID-19 hub, and not all brands need to do this by tackling COVID-19 head on, by the way. But in this case, they saw a need for really reliable information and a need for taking that information and making it useful and applied to your own business. And they've created this pretty remarkable place. I mean, I personally go to it on a regular basis. So for me, I think, that's a sign like it must be a pretty great resource just in general that you're attracting people who aren't even your core target because you're providing such a great service. So I think that's an example of a brand that really stepped in to give businesses, their customers and those who are not their customers, and individuals this wealth of access and tools to help make sense of the inflow of information that we've been getting for the last few months. So that's one example. I also think that we have some other examples of brands that have stepped in and if their core product isn't necessarily a solution to what's going on right now, they've thought about what is it that they do best and how can they use that, whatever that capability is, to do something that really can help balance out that equation that we talked about. So I think I mentioned in the op-ed a few months ago that that there are plenty of brands that we can point to now that have shifted their production lines. They're making PPE, they're making hand sanitizer. These are real changes that they've made to their business model in order to step in and make a difference. And I love those examples, because I think that that means you are part of the fabric of community. You're part of the fabric of the solution as well. So I think, LVMH is probably the most well-known business to have done that, but we have lots of other examples of smaller, for instance, distilleries. We have plenty of examples of even community networks that are printing PPE masks with 3D printers, and small businesses that have completely changed what they do to do the same. So those are just some of the many examples.
Yeah, and it's inspiring to watch how people are coming together in these ways. Like, I know so many people who are knitting face masks, and I love that. Like, I don't know how to knit, so I can't really do that, but
yeah, in the first few weeks, and I think later on we'll get into a data slide, but in the first few weeks, I started sewing face masks to hand out to people that didn't have them, or neighbors. And I very quickly realized that the world was sold out of key ingredients for a good face mask. There was no elastic, there was no interfacing. There are all these things that all of a sudden were gone in the world. And I remember thinking, there must be millions of people out there who are busy sewing, doing whatever they can to make a positive difference. And it's heartening. Those are the kinds of stories that help us think, we're not just going to get through this. We're going to get through this, and there are going to be some silver linings.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And you mentioned that you wrote an op-ed for us a few months ago, kind of in the beginning of quarantine. And in your article, you talked about providing service in these times of crisis. So in what other ways, like not directly related to helping people necessarily locate information about the virus, do you feel that brands can be of service? And any examples that you have of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we just there. Am I back? Great. Yes. There are businesses that can step in and use their operations and their production line to really make a difference right now. And we have lots of examples, like we just talked about, of businesses that have done that. There are also businesses that can make a huge difference just by staying in operation. And that's a challenge for a lot of businesses right now. I mean, whether that's you're making a difference because you're still able to pay your employees, you're still able to provide a service, even when you're under pressure financially, which a lot of businesses are facing right now. I keep thinking we've had a lot of conversations with colleagues and even through some of our qualitative research with people who are, have relied in the past on public transportation, and they don't know how they're going to get through the next few months. And for them, a huge service is being able to get a car. And, there are things that people still need, and finding ways to offer those products and services, if that's what you do, that can be a very straightforward way of being of service right now. Finally, I do think that there's a role for brands to provide an amplifying voice to some of the great work that's going out there at a community level or through not-for-profits, and use their platform as a way to do that. So that's another way to really be of service right now, is to amplify the voices of the people making a difference, the people who could use your support to make an even bigger difference. I think we have an example slide from some work that we've done, which is just an example of one of the many businesses doing this right now. But we work with PayPal, and they've done this project with us, which was a really quick turn project that's really about highlighting those people in the community that are taking really generous actions. They're coming together, in this case, to create face shields, these masks, both for infants and for nurses. And they're using their platform to promote these not-for-profits that have been, in some cases, organized by just groups of people and friends who have a skill or a capability that's really meaningful. And this not only helps raise money for them to make more of these masks, and PayPal then can support that with financially, but it gives them a voice where they otherwise, we would never have heard this story. And I think that that's another role that brands can play. Brands are so powerful as a platform. And you thinking about how you can use that platform for good is another way to be of service right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you shared some data with us about people seeking out positive content at this time, which, makes a lot of sense. So can you talk more about how when your article kind of first went live, we were in what felt like a phase 1 of quarantine, and now we're definitely in a different phase as quarantine is extended, and we're about 2.5 months in.
Yeah. One of the things that, and just when we started talking, we were talking about what are the things that we've done as T brand, and how we've adapted to shelter in place and to the changes and that we've all experienced. And one of the ways is to really start leaning hard into our role as sense makers, and that means data. That means looking at behavior, looking at how people are feeling. It really means about staying as close as possible to what's happening on the ground. And one of the things that we've seen is that people have moved through, and I don't want to say this is predictable, because when you look at a crisis, there is some level of predictability into how people process what's happening to them and to their communities. But in this case, what we saw very clearly was that at the beginning, which is back when I wrote the op-ed, people were still in a mindset of fear and confusion for the most part. Not everybody was experiencing fear, but everybody was experiencing some form of confusion. What's going on? And we saw people, really going hard and seeking out constant sources of new information. And that makes sense, because we're out there trying to get some clarity about what we're facing. The next phase that people go into tends to be around understanding what the new context is, right? So I've gotten over my fear, and now it's about making sense of what's happening around me. And we saw this on our own platform at the New York Times. We saw this in terms of people going more and more towards opinion. They were reading about the spillover effect of COVID on business. They were reading about health through our well section. So we saw more and more people shifting to these sort of deeper analysis of the context around them. Then they moved from that into what could be defined as sort of a stage of self-care to some extent. We recognize there's some kind of change and a new normal, and now we need to figure out how we're going to survive in this, and hopefully find more than just survival amongst it, right? And these are all emotional states that I think when we look back, make perfect sense. I think the hard thing is always identifying what's the emotion right now. And one of the things that is happening now, as we look at both the qualitative research that we've been doing on a regular basis, about every 2 weeks, and then also looking at just the contextual data that we can access, one of the things that we're seeing is that people have reached a stage of acceptance. And acceptance is an interesting state of mind, because it leads to a whole new set of emotions. And those emotions, from a public health standpoint, which is part of my background, some of those emotions can lead us to what we would call in the public health word adverse behaviors, because we say, you know what, I'm sick of this. I'm done with it. Like, it's going to be with us for a while, and I'm done with it. On the other side of the equation, acceptance can lead to an opportunity to start to be hopeful about building a new future. Those new roots I talked about. Even as individuals, we have to plant those new roots. And that's the stage we're in now. And for brands, it's an opportunity to actually help people find those and access some positivity about what those new roots will look like. And we see people seeking out that more positive content. We also see people seeking out distraction, which we've seen the whole time. There's always been a need for distraction. But I think right now, distraction has taken on more meaning, in as much as we are COVID conscious about everything now. So we want to engage with content that, while obviously it's altered because of COVID, it's still content we're familiar with. So we've seen a big uptick in arts and sports, for instance. And I think that's a sign of the desire to engage with that kind of content. When it comes to positivity in its pure form, I do want to call out, you know, we're not talking about ignoring reality and providing, you know, messaging or communications that are asking people to simply put on a smile and ignore what's going on. This is much more about providing people with legitimate, concrete, authentic, that's a word you use, Nicole, authentic reasons to be positive going forward. And so I think that's where we are right now, at least from a communication standpoint.
Yeah, it also reminds me of this article that I read very early on in quarantine about how a lot of what we're dealing with, these mix of emotions and the stages that they kind of come in are like stages of grief. And like we're grieving for the plans that we had. We're grieving for, you know, whatever intentions we had set for ourselves in the beginning of the year that like now might not happen in the same way. And it ultimately does come with acceptance, which doesn't, it could be like you said, being like, oh, I forget this. I'm just accepting that this is what it's like and whatever. It could also be like, okay, I'm accepting this and here's my new path forward. Like, here's what I have to do now.
Exactly. And I do think, you know, I think it's legitimate to talk about stages of mourning because we are all experiencing a loss, as you say, of the plans we had, of a lot of what was familiar to us. And without knowing what the next phase of our lives look like exactly, this level of uncertainty has an opportunity to breed both sides of that emotional equation, the adverse and the positive, which is the new paths forward. And as much as we can help people feel like they can move in that positive way forward, especially through concrete actions, right? I mean, it always goes back to, is there something we can do for people, not just say to them? As much as we can do that, I think we can really help as people on an individual level, but also society as a whole to, in a sense, complete this process that we're in right now. So I think it's a very fair metaphor, you know, to think through.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jane. This was a really insightful conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nicole.
Yeah, definitely. And for all you viewers out there, please tune back in tomorrow again at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Our Deputy Brand Editor, Diana Pearl, is going to chat with Amber Vensbox, a designer and entrepreneur, talking about the influencer economy in the time of COVID-19. And you can find all of our episodes of Adweek Together at adweek.com/together. And don't forget to sign up for an Adweek Pro subscription. You can just go to adweek.com/offer to find that. Thanks again.